The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's large home, painting golden shapes on the polished marble floor. Her house stood at the top of a quiet street, surrounded by iron gates and trimmed hedges that looked like they had been cut with rulers. Everything in her life was neat, proper, and expensive. From the silver spoons in the kitchen to the grand piano in her living room, Eleanor liked things that showed order. That day started like any other. She was sitting in the sunroom reading her newspaper when the sound of clinking dishes came from the kitchen. Her maid Denise was cleaning up after lunch. Eleanor liked Denise. The woman was polite, quiet, and didn't speak more than needed. She had been working for Eleanor for almost 6 months now, and there had never been a problem. But that day, Eleanor noticed something different. There was a faint humming sound mixed with the noise of the dishes. At first, she thought it was the radio left on somewhere. Then she listened carefully. The tune was too steady, too alive. Someone was humming a melody, softly but with feeling. She got up, walked toward the kitchen, and stood quietly near the door. Denise was scrubbing the sink, her back turned. The humming wasn't coming from her. It was coming from a boy sitting on a stool near the back door. He was about 10, wearing a simple shirt and a pair of jeans that were too short at the ankles. His feet swung slowly above the floor as he hummed to himself, tapping his fingers on his knee like invisible keys. Eleanor realized it was Denise's son. She had seen him only a few times before, always waiting quietly while his mother finished work. He never made a fuss, never ran around the house like other children might have. He just waited, head bowed, eyes calm. The humming stopped when he noticed her watching. The boy froze, then lowered his gaze quickly, his small hands tightening around his knees. Eleanor spoke in her calm, firm tone. "What's your name again, dear?" He hesitated. "Malik, ma'am." "Malik," she repeated. "That's a nice name. You like music, I hear." He shrugged lightly. "I just like how it sounds." Eleanor smiled, though her tone stayed slightly amused. "Do you play any instruments?" "No, ma'am," he said softly. "But I listen." Something about the way he said it made her curious. There was no arrogance in his voice, no eagerness to impress. Just simple truth. She looked toward the large living room where her black grand piano sat. It had belonged to her late husband, a man who used to play after dinner every night before he passed away. She hadn't touched it in years. The housekeeper polished it once a week, but its lid had been closed since then. A sudden idea crossed her mind, half a joke, half curiosity. "Would you like to try playing it?" She asked lightly. Denise turned around at once, startled. "Oh no, ma'am, he doesn't. He's just a boy. He doesn't know anything about pianos." But Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's all right, Denise. Just a few keys won't hurt. Let him try." Denise looked uneasy, but she didn't argue. Malik glanced at his mother for permission. She sighed, nodded slightly, and wiped her hands on her apron. Eleanor led the way to the living room. The boy followed quietly, his eyes wide as he looked around. Everything in the room seemed too perfect. Paintings on the wall, the crystal vase on the table, and the piano shining under the afternoon light. Eleanor stopped beside the piano and gently lifted the lid. The smell of polished wood filled the room. She motioned for Malik to sit on the stool. He hesitated, then climbed up slowly, sitting stiffly, unsure where to place his hands. "Go on," Eleanor said kindly. "Just press a few keys." His small fingers touched the ivory. At first, he pressed a single note. The sound floated gently through the room. He looked at the keys as if they were alive. Then, without anyone saying a word, he began to play another note, then another. Soon the notes joined together, soft, uneven, but strangely beautiful. Eleanor froze. She had expected random noise, but what came out was something else. There was a rhythm, a shape to it, like a song that wanted to be born. His hands were awkward, but his ears guided him. He tilted his head slightly, listening, adjusting, finding patterns. Denise stood near the doorway, hands pressed to her chest, torn between pride and fear. Malik continued for almost a full minute, lost in the sound. Then he stopped, realizing what he was doing. He turned quickly, eyes wide with apology. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "I didn't mean to." Eleanor raised her hand gently. "Don't be sorry." She stepped closer. "Who taught you that?" "No one," he said. "I just remember songs I hear. On the radio, sometimes on TV." Eleanor stared at him, her curiosity deepening. "And you can play them? Just by hearing?" He nodded shyly. She exchanged a glance with Denise, who looked uncomfortable. He's always been like that, Denise said softly. Ever since he was little. He hums what he hears. I never thought much of it. Eleanor smiled faintly. It's not something to ignore, dear. Your boy seems to have a gift. Denise looked down, her expression unsure. I just want him to stay focused in school, ma'am. Music doesn't pay the bills. Not for people like us. There was a silence. Eleanor's smile faded, replaced by thought. She looked again at the boy, at the way his fingers lingered near the keys, how his eyes still glowed with quiet wonder. It reminded her of her husband when he first brought the piano home. She remembered his laughter, the way he said that music made the house feel alive. After he passed, she had shut the piano lid because every note reminded her of him. And now somehow a little boy had brought that sound back without even knowing. Would you like to play again sometime? She asked. Malik's face lit up, but he quickly hid his excitement, glancing at his mother. Denise hesitated, then nodded slightly. Yes, ma'am, Malik said softly. Good, Eleanor said. Then it settled. She closed the piano gently and walked toward the window, hiding the small smile forming on her face. She didn't quite understand why she cared so much, but something inside her had shifted. Later that evening, when Denise finished work, Eleanor sat in her armchair with her tea, lost in thought. The melody Malik had played still echoed faintly in her mind. It wasn't perfect, but it had heart. Something real, something that couldn't be taught. She looked at the piano again, its black surface gleaming in the dim light. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a piece of furniture. It felt alive again. As Denise and Malik prepared to leave, Eleanor called out, Denise, make sure he comes along tomorrow as well. I'd like to hear more of his tunes. Denise looked surprised. Of course, ma'am. If you really want to. I do, Eleanor said softly. He's welcome. When the door closed behind them, the house fell silent again. But this time it was a pleasant kind of silence filled with something warm and hopeful. Eleanor leaned back, thinking about how strange life could be. How a moment of curiosity could open a door you didn't know existed. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the melody he played, soft, uncertain, but full of feeling. It wasn't just sound. It was something deeper. She thought of Denise, a woman who worked hard but carried quiet dignity. She thought of the boy sitting still on the piano stool, finding beauty in simple keys. And she wondered, not for the first time, if perhaps she had been wrong all these years to believe that talent belonged only to those who could afford it. The next morning, as the housekeeper brought her breakfast tray, Eleanor walked to the piano again. She ran her fingers along the lid, then opened it. For a brief moment, she imagined the boy sitting there again, his small hands exploring the keys. She smiled. Maybe tomorrow she would ask him to play a little longer. Maybe she would even find some of her late husband's old sheet music, just to see what the boy could do. The thought made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. Outside, the sun rose slowly over the garden, filling the house with light. Inside, for the first time in years, Eleanor felt that her quiet home might soon have music again. And somewhere across town, a little boy was humming the same tune he had played the day before, his mother shaking her head with a small smile as they walked to the bus stop. Neither of them knew that what had happened that afternoon would change their lives forever. The next afternoon, the sun was warm again, shining across the front porch where birds rested on the railings. Denise arrived for work a few minutes early, as she always did. But this time she wasn't alone. Her son walked beside her, carrying his small backpack, his steps quiet but eager. When they reached the door, he looked up at his mother. "Do you think she'll really let me play again?" he asked. Denise sighed and adjusted her bag. "If she said you can, then you can. But remember to behave. Don't touch anything else in that house, you understand?" He nodded quickly. The maid knocked softly and the butler opened the door. He greeted her with a polite nod, though his eyes moved curiously to the boy. A few minutes later, Mrs. Whitmore came into the hallway, dressed neatly in a cream-colored dress, holding her morning tea. "Well, good afternoon," she said warmly. "You're early." "Yes, ma'am," Denise said quickly. "I thought I'd start with the dusting before lunch." Eleanor looked down at Malik, who stood straight, his backpack still in his hands. "And you, young man," she said with a faint smile. "Are you ready to play a little more today?" He smiled shyly. "If you want me to, ma'am." "I do," she said. "Come along." She led him to the same room where sunlight fell across the polished floor and the piano gleamed like glass. The boy followed her quietly, setting his bag in a corner before sitting on the stool. "Do you remember what you played yesterday?" she asked. He nodded, his small fingers resting on the keys. He pressed one, then another, finding the same soft melody he had played the day before. This time, his hands were a little more confident. Eleanor stood behind him, listening. The notes floated through the air, gentle and warm. They weren't perfect, but they were full of life. When he finished, she clapped softly. "That was lovely," she said. "How do you know which keys to press?" He looked at her as if the question was strange. "I just hear them in my head, ma'am. The sound tells me where to go." "You've never had a teacher?" He shook his head. She thought for a moment, then turned toward the bookshelf near the wall. She pulled out a thin book of beginner piano pieces, one her husband had used years ago when he tried to teach her. She placed it on the piano stand and opened it. "Do you know how to read this?" she asked. He leaned closer, squinting at the black marks on the white page. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "I never learned," she smiled gently. "That's all right. Why don't I play it for you once and you try to copy?" She sat beside him and pressed the keys slowly, showing him the notes. It was a simple tune, a children's song, but the sound filled the room with a kind of charm. When she finished, he nodded and placed his hands on the keys again. He played it back almost perfectly. Eleanor blinked. "You remembered that after hearing it once?" He nodded again, quietly. She couldn't hide her surprise. "That's remarkable." Just then, Denise came in to ask about lunch, but stopped when she heard the music. Her eyes softened. "You're letting him play again, ma'am?" "Yes," Eleanor said with a smile. "And he's quite something." Denise looked embarrassed, as if unsure whether to feel proud or worried. "I don't want him to bother you, ma'am. He just gets carried away sometimes." "He's not bothering me," Eleanor said kindly. "He's refreshing." When Denise went back to work, Eleanor stayed near the piano, watching the boy as he explored. He tried different notes, mixing them until he found something that sounded right. Every few minutes he would hum quietly, then play what he hummed. "Do you know?" she said softly. "Some people spend years learning to do what you just do naturally." He looked up. "Really?" "Really," she said, smiling. "You have something very special." He smiled shyly, not knowing how to reply. As the day went on, Eleanor found excuses to keep him playing. She had him try new tunes, made him listen to short recordings on her old music player, and watched him reproduce them almost instantly. He made small mistakes, but he corrected them faster than most trained students would have. When Denise finished work that evening, she found her son still sitting by the piano, fingers moving lightly as if the music refused to leave him. "Come on, Malik," she said gently. "Time to go." He looked disappointed. "Can I play again tomorrow?" Denise glanced nervously at her employer. Eleanor smiled. "Of course you can." As they left, she stood by the window and watched them walk down the long driveway. The image stirred something in her heart, a memory she hadn't felt in years. Her husband had once said that music could change a person's life. She had smiled at the time, thinking he was being poetic. Now she wasn't so sure. The next morning, Eleanor found herself waiting. She read the newspaper but didn't really see the words. When Denise arrived, she greeted her quickly and asked, "Did Malik come today?" "Yes, ma'am," Denise said, looking a little surprised. "He's outside." "Good. Send him in when you're ready." When the boy entered the room again, he seemed more confident. He walked straight to the piano as if it belonged to him. She noticed how his fingers hovered over the keys before playing, almost like a painter studying a blank canvas. He began with a tune she didn't recognize. It wasn't from her books or any record she had played for him. It was something of his own, soft, slow, and full of feeling. When he finished, she asked quietly, "Where did you learn that one?" He looked thoughtful. "I made it up," he said. "It just came to me." "You made it up?" She repeated, her eyebrows lifting. He nodded. "Sometimes I hear songs in my head that don't exist yet." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. She felt an odd mix of amazement and emotion that she couldn't quite name. "You have a gift, child," she said at last. "A true one." Later that week, Eleanor decided to call an old friend, Mrs. Campbell, a retired music teacher who had taught many children in town. She invited her over for tea, not telling her exactly why. When Mrs. Campbell arrived, Eleanor explained softly, "I have someone I'd like you to hear. A young boy. No training, no lessons. Just listen and tell me what you think." Mrs. Campbell smiled politely, expecting little. But when Malik began to play, her expression slowly changed. Her eyes widened, her smile faded, and she leaned forward in silence. When he finished, she turned to Eleanor, whispering, "This boy has perfect pitch." Eleanor frowned. "Perfect pitch? It means he can hear any note and know exactly what it is," Mrs. Campbell said. "It's very rare. He was born with it." Eleanor looked at Malik, who sat quietly, unaware of what was being said. "So he's special?" she asked softly. "Very," Mrs. Campbell replied. "With the right training, he could be exceptional." After the teacher left, Eleanor sat in silence for a long time. She thought about her own childhood, how she had been given piano lessons, tutors, and every opportunity, yet never learned beyond the basics. She thought about Denise working hard every day, never asking for anything extra. And she thought about this boy, who had nothing, yet carried something inside him that couldn't be bought. That evening, as Denise was finishing her chores, Eleanor called her into the sitting room. "Denise," she began gently, "your son is very talented. My friend says he has something called perfect pitch. It's rare." Denise looked unsure. "I don't know much about that, ma'am. I just know he loves music. But I can't afford lessons. Those things cost money I don't have." Eleanor nodded. "I understand. That's why I'd like to help." Denise's eyes widened. "Help? I can pay for his piano lessons," Eleanor said calmly. "I know a wonderful teacher who would take him on." "It would be my pleasure." Denise shook her head quickly. "Oh no, ma'am. I can't let you do that." "You've already been too kind." "It's not kindness," Eleanor said softly. "It's what he deserves." Denise hesitated. "I don't want him to think life gives things for free. He should earn what he gets." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then let this be something he earns by using the gift he already has." The room went quiet. Denise looked at the floor, torn between gratitude and worry. Finally, she whispered, "I'll think about it." "Of course," Eleanor said. "Take your time." After they left, Eleanor walked back to the piano and touched the keys gently. She could still hear the faint sound of Malik's music in the room, as if it lingered in the air even after he was gone. She sat down, pressed one note, then another, trying to follow his little melody. It wasn't the same, it never would be, but it made her smile. Something inside her had changed. For years her home had been quiet, filled only with routine and memories. Now it had a heartbeat again, and it came from a boy who saw music not as notes or lessons, but as something that lived inside him. That night she made a promise to herself. If the boy's mother allowed it, she would make sure his gift didn't go to waste. He had brought light back into her house. The least she could do was help him let that light shine everywhere else. Days passed quietly after Mrs. Whitmore offered to help Malik. Denise didn't answer right away. Every evening when they reached home, she would sit by the small kitchen table while Malik talked excitedly about the piano, how it sounded, what he played, and what he wanted to learn next. Denise would listen, smile, and nod, but her heart felt heavy. She didn't know if she should accept the offer. She had worked for enough rich families to know that sometimes generosity came with strings. She didn't want her son to grow up thinking someone else could decide his future. She also didn't want to take advantage of her employer's kindness. But one evening, as she was folding laundry, Malik came to her with shining eyes. "Mama," he said softly, "when I play the piano, it feels like talking without words. I can tell stories. I can see colors." She stopped folding and looked at him. "Colors?" He nodded. "When I play soft notes, I see blue. When I play loud ones, it's red. I can't explain it, but I feel it." Denise smiled sadly. "Your mind works in special ways, my boy. I don't want you to lose that." He looked down. "Then why do you look sad when I talk about it?" She sighed, brushing his cheek gently. "Because I don't want you to get hurt, Malik. Sometimes, life doesn't let people like us dream too far." He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he stayed quiet. The next day at work, Denise decided to speak to Mrs. Whitmore. She found her in the sitting room, reading by the window. The morning light made her silver hair glow softly. "Ma'am," Denise began carefully, "about what you said. The lessons for my boy." Eleanor looked up from her book, smiling. "Yes, I thought about it. I don't want to take charity, ma'am. But if you're sure it's truly what you want to do, and if it's not a burden, it's not a burden at all, Eleanor said, closing her book. It would make me very happy. Denise hesitated. He's just a boy. Maybe he'll change his mind one day. Eleanor nodded. Then we'll cross that bridge when it comes. But for now, let's give him a chance. Denise's shoulders relaxed slightly. All right then, ma'am. I'll agree. That afternoon, Eleanor called her friend Mrs. Campbell again and arranged for Malik to start lessons the following week. She offered to pay for everything, the books, the travel, even a small electric keyboard for him to practice at home. When she told Malik, his eyes widened in disbelief. For me? He asked. Eleanor smiled. For you. You've earned it. He ran to his mother and hugged her tightly. Denise laughed softly, though her eyes grew wet. She hadn't seen her son this happy in a long time. The first lesson day came quickly. Mrs. Campbell lived in a cozy house at the edge of town, her music room filled with warm light and shelves of old music sheets. She welcomed Malik kindly, showing him how to sit properly and how to hold his hands above the keys. At first, he struggled to follow her notes on paper. The small black dots and lines didn't make sense to him. But when she played a melody once, he repeated it almost exactly. After a few minutes, she realized that teaching him the usual way wouldn't work. You have something called an ear for music, she told him gently. You don't need to read much yet. We'll start by training your memory and your touch. Malik listened carefully, nodding. In the following weeks, his progress was astonishing. He picked up every song he heard, adding small touches of his own. Mrs. Campbell couldn't hide her amazement when he played short pieces by famous composers, after only hearing them once. Eleanor attended one of his early lessons and sat quietly in the corner. She watched the boy play, his head tilted slightly, his face calm but full of focus. When he finished, she found herself clapping without realizing it. You were right, my dear, Mrs. Campbell said to her afterward. This child is rare. His ear, his sense of timing, it's beyond his years. Eleanor smiled proudly, as though he were her own grandson. Soon, Malik began spending more time in the music room at Eleanor's house than anywhere else. She had his small keyboard set up in a corner for practice, and whenever she wasn't reading or hosting guests, she would sit nearby and listen. She started noticing little things, the way his fingers curved perfectly on the keys, the way he would close his eyes when he played, and how he seemed to disappear into the sound. She realized that the house felt brighter when he was around. One afternoon, after a long practice session, Eleanor brought him a glass of lemonade. You must be tired, she said, smiling. He shook his head. No, ma'am. When I play, I don't get tired. It feels like I'm resting, she chuckled. You remind me of someone I once knew. My husband used to say that music was his escape. Maybe you two would have gotten along. Malik looked around at the piano. Did he play this one? Yes, she said softly. He played every evening before dinner. The house hasn't sounded alive like this since he passed. Malik didn't say anything, but his face grew thoughtful. Then he began to play something soft and sweet, his own way of saying thank you. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened. For a moment, she felt as if her husband were in the room again, smiling. As months went by, Malik's name started spreading quietly among local musicians. Mrs. Campbell mentioned him to one of her former students, who ran a small music school in the city. They invited him to perform at a community recital. When Eleanor told Denise about it, she almost dropped the dish she was washing. A recital? In front of people? Yes, Eleanor said excitedly. It's just a small event, but it'll give him confidence. Denise looked nervous. He's never been on a stage before. He'll be fine, Eleanor assured her. He's ready. The night of the recital, the hall buzzed with chatter and laughter. Children tuned their instruments. Parents whispered, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and flowers. Malik wore a neat white shirt Eleanor had bought for him and a tie that was slightly too big. He sat backstage fidgeting with his fingers. Denise knelt beside him. Just play like you do at home, she said softly. Don't think about the people. He nodded, his small hands trembling a little. When it was his turn, he walked to the piano under the bright lights. The room fell silent. He took a deep breath, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. The first few notes were quiet and unsure, but then something shifted. His fear melted away, replaced by focus. The sound grew richer, warmer. The audience leaned forward, drawn in by the way he played, not just with skill but with heart. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Some people even stood up. Denise covered her mouth with her hands, tears in her eyes. Eleanor clapped harder than anyone else, her heart swelling with pride. Afterward, several people came to compliment him. A local reporter even took a picture saying, "That boy has magic in his fingers." On the way home, Malik sat quietly in the back seat of Eleanor's car, still holding the small program from the recital. "Did you like it?" he asked her. "Like it?" she said, smiling. "I loved it. You made everyone in that room feel something beautiful." He looked out the window, watching the city lights pass by. "I want to do that forever," he whispered. "Make people feel things." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Then that's exactly what you'll do." At home, Denise tucked him into bed, brushing his hair gently. "You did so well tonight," she said. "I'm proud of you," he smiled sleepily. "Mrs. Whitmore said music makes people feel alive." Denise nodded. "She's right." After he fell asleep, Denise sat in the dark for a while thinking. Maybe she had been too afraid. Maybe people like her and her son did deserve good things sometimes. The next morning, Eleanor received a call from Mrs. Campbell. "You won't believe this," she said excitedly. "Someone who was at the recital works with a youth orchestra. They want to meet Malik. They think he could be part of a special program." Eleanor felt a rush of joy, and then something else. Protectiveness. She knew opportunities like this could change a child's life, but they could also be overwhelming. She looked out at her garden, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze, and whispered to herself, "He's going to need both of us now, someone to teach him and someone to keep him grounded." For the first time in years, Eleanor felt she had a purpose again, not one that came from her wealth or her name, but from helping a young boy find his path. And as for Malik, he woke up that morning with music still in his head, unaware that his life was about to grow even bigger than he had ever imagined. The days after the recital felt different. Malik walked with a new spark in his step. Even his teachers at school noticed how he hummed softly during lessons, tapping rhythms on his desk without realizing. Denise couldn't help but smile whenever she saw him like that. Her son had always been a quiet child, but now he carried a quiet confidence too. At Mrs. Whitmore's house, things began to change as well. The once silent rooms now had music flowing through them almost every afternoon. Eleanor found herself looking forward to hearing Malik play. It gave her something to wake up for, something that reminded her there was still beauty in ordinary days. Soon after the recital, the youth orchestra Mrs. Campbell had mentioned reached out again. They invited Malik to visit the music academy for an informal audition. It wasn't just a school. It was a place where talented children trained under skilled mentors. When Eleanor told Denise the news, she looked shocked. "An academy? That's for rich families, ma'am. We can't." "You can," Eleanor said gently. "And you will. I'll take care of the fees. He deserves this chance." Denise hesitated, unsure how to respond, but when she saw Malik's face light up at the thought, she couldn't say no. On the day of the audition, Malik wore his best clothes, a crisp shirt that Eleanor had pressed herself and the same pair of clean shoes he had worn at the recital. He looked nervous as they walked into the large building with tall glass doors and long, echoing hallways. Inside, everything smelled of polished wood and new books. Children carried violins, cellos, and sheet music as they moved between rooms. The sound of instruments filled the air like 100 tiny stories happening at once. Mrs. Campbell was there to greet them, smiling warmly. "Don't be nervous," she whispered to Malik. "Just play the way you always do." They entered a small hall where 3 instructors sat behind a table. Malik bowed slightly, as Mrs. Campbell had taught him, and sat at the piano. For a few seconds he froze. The hall was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. Then slowly his fingers began to move. He played one of his favorite pieces, a song he had learned by ear but added his own twists to. It started softly, then built into something rich and emotional. The instructors leaned forward, whispering among themselves. When he finished, there was a long pause before one of them said quietly, "How long has he been learning?" Mrs. Campbell smiled proudly. "Less than a year." They exchanged looks, impressed. The youngest of the instructors stood up, walked closer, and said, "Son, music lives inside you, doesn't it?" Malik nodded shyly. "Yes, sir. It's like I hear it all the time." That was enough. The next week, he received a letter of acceptance. He had been given a scholarship to join the academy. When Denise read the letter, tears filled her eyes. She sat down at the small kitchen table, holding the paper as if it were gold. Malik hugged her tightly, laughing. Eleanor watched quietly, smiling. She had seen many good things in her life, but nothing felt quite like this. Life began to move faster. Malik started going to the academy 3 times a week after school. The classes were challenging, but he loved every minute of it. He met other students who shared his passion, and for the first time he didn't feel out of place. Still, things weren't easy. Denise worked longer hours to cover their daily needs, refusing to let Eleanor pay for everything. She often came home exhausted but never complained. She would sit by the window at night, listening to the faint sounds of her son practicing on the small keyboard, and whisper to herself, "It's worth it." Eleanor, on the other hand, found herself becoming deeply invested in Malik's progress. She attended his performances, spoke with his teachers, and even rearranged her daily schedule to be available when he came to practice. She felt like she had been given a second chance at life through him. One afternoon, after a long practice, Malik sat beside Eleanor in the garden. The air was cool and the sound of leaves rustling filled the silence. "Ma'am," he said softly, "why are you so nice to me?" Eleanor looked at him with a kind smile. "Because you remind me of what matters. You make me see the world the way I used to when I was young." He looked down. "Mama says people like us don't get lucky much, but I think meeting you was more than luck." She reached out and touched his shoulder gently. "Sometimes life brings people together for a reason, Malik. Maybe mine was to help you find your way. And maybe yours was to remind me how to feel again." He smiled, not fully understanding, but sensing the warmth in her words. Months turned into a year. Malik's talent continued to bloom. He began composing short pieces of his own, soft tunes that told stories of everyday life. One piece he wrote, called "Evening Light," made Mrs. Campbell cry the first time she heard it. "You don't just play music," she told him. "You speak through it." Eleanor often invited friends over to listen to him play. Her elegant drawing room, once quiet and formal, now filled with laughter and applause. People couldn't believe the small boy at the piano had learned to play so beautifully in such a short time. But with every success came new challenges. The more people noticed him, the more pressure he felt to be perfect. There were days he grew frustrated, his fingers missing keys or his mind going blank during lessons. He would come home quiet and tired. Denise noticed it first. "You need rest," she told him one evening. "You can't chase music every hour of the day." "I can't stop," he said, rubbing his eyes. "If I stop, I'll forget." She knelt beside him. "You won't forget. The music's inside you. It's not going anywhere." Her words comforted him, but deep down she worried. He was still just a child, yet the world already expected greatness from him. Eleanor, too, saw the strain. One afternoon she found him sitting silently at the piano, staring at the keys. "What's wrong?" she asked. He shrugged. "Nothing sounds right today." She sat beside him. "Then maybe today isn't a day for playing. Maybe it's a day for listening." He looked puzzled. "Listening to what?" She smiled. "Everything else. The wind, the birds, your own thoughts. Even silence can teach you something." He nodded slowly. They sat together in quiet peace for a long time. By the next week, he was back to playing again, stronger and more focused. That summer, the Academy announced a regional youth piano competition. It was one of the biggest in the state, and Mrs. Campbell urged him to participate. "It's time the world heard you," she said. Eleanor and Denise were nervous, but Malik wanted to try. He practiced for hours each day, working on a piece he had written himself. It was gentle, full of hope, and inspired by the people around him, his mother, Mrs. Campbell, and Eleanor. The day of the competition arrived, and the concert hall was packed. The air buzzed with excitement as students from different towns prepared to perform. Malik waited backstage, hands slightly trembling, whispering the melody to himself. When his turn came, he walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, but he could see Eleanor and his mother sitting in the front row, smiling proudly. That gave him strength. He began to play. The first few notes flowed softly, then grew stronger, filling the hall with warmth. The melody told a story of love, struggle, and gratitude. Every key seemed to hold emotion deeper than words. When the final note faded, there was silence for a heartbeat, and then thunderous applause. Some people even stood up, clapping with tears in their eyes. Denise pressed her hands over her heart, crying. crying openly. Eleanor wiped a tear from her cheek, whispering, "He did it." Later that evening, when the judges announced the results, Malik's name was called as the winner. The entire hall cheered. He walked up to receive his medal, his hands trembling as he looked out at the crowd. Afterward, reporters asked him about his story, how long he had been playing, who taught him, what inspired him. Malik simply said, "My mother taught me love and Mrs. Whitmore taught me to believe in it." Eleanor smiled proudly, but when she heard her name, her eyes filled again. She had never expected to be thanked. She just wanted to help. That night, as they all rode home together, Malik leaned his head against the car window, smiling sleepily. "I want to keep playing forever," he murmured. Eleanor looked at him through the rearview mirror. "You will, dear. The world needs your music." Denise turned toward her employer and said softly, "Thank you, ma'am, for everything. You gave my boy something I never could." Eleanor shook her head gently. "No, Denise. You gave him the heart. I just helped him find the keys." Outside, the city lights shimmered as they drove through the quiet streets. Inside the car, no one spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The sound of the boy's laughter, soft and tired, said everything. That night, Eleanor stood by the piano in her living room long after they left. She touched the keys lightly, remembering how it all began, with a small boy humming in her kitchen, and she whispered, almost to herself, music found its way home again. The years moved forward quietly, the way time often does when life is full but steady. Malik grew taller, his hands longer, his shoulders broader. Yet every time he sat at a piano, he still became that same boy who once played by ear in a rich woman's parlor. His music had changed, though. It carried more weight now, more feeling. It was no longer just sound. It was memory. He had continued studying at the academy, and his name had started appearing in local newspapers and small concert programs. Young prodigy from humble beginnings, they called him. Denise kept every clipping in a small box under her bed, wrapped in a piece of blue cloth. She would take them out sometimes after work, reading each word slowly as if it were a prayer. Eleanor watched his rise with quiet pride. She attended every concert she could, her cane tapping softly as she walked through crowded halls. She had grown older, and her hair had turned completely silver, but her eyes still lit up whenever Malik played. It reminded her that even after all her years of comfort and wealth, true beauty wasn't found in possessions. It was found in people. One chilly evening, a letter arrived at the house. Denise brought it to Eleanor's sitting room, her hands trembling. It was from a National Music Foundation. Malik had been chosen to represent the Academy in a nationwide competition for young pianists. The winner would receive a scholarship to study abroad. Denise could hardly speak. "Abroad? That's the kind of thing you see on television," Eleanor smiled. "It seems the world is starting to hear what I heard that day in my parlor." Malik didn't say much when he heard the news. He just nodded and said quietly, "I'll do my best." But inside he felt a mix of excitement and fear. It was one thing to play in local halls, but this would be on television in front of thousands. The weeks leading up to the competition were long and exhausting. Malik practiced for hours each day, fine-tuning every note, every pause, every emotion. Denise made sure he ate well and rested, though she often caught him awake at midnight still at the keyboard. Eleanor sat with him sometimes, just listening. She didn't speak much during those moments. She didn't have to. Her presence alone told him she believed in him. When the day finally arrived, the three of them traveled to the capital city. The hall was massive, bigger than any place Malik had ever seen. The stage was polished, the lights bright, and the crowd endless. Cameras moved quietly around the room. Malik looked small against the grand piano at the center of it all. Backstage, he paced nervously while Denise straightened his collar. "You don't have to win," she told him softly. "You've already come so far." He smiled faintly. "I want to play for you, Mama, for everything you gave up for me." Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Play for yourself too, dear. The world will listen, but this music, it's yours." When his name was called, Malik walked out to the piano. The lights hit his face, and for a moment the noise of the audience faded away. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began. The piece he had chosen was one he'd written himself, a song inspired by his journey. It started softly, almost like a whisper, then grew into something full and rich. The notes told of a boy in a quiet house, a mother working late, and a woman who heard music where no one else did. Every key carried love, struggle, and gratitude. The audience listened in silence. Even the judges leaned forward, completely drawn in. When the last note faded, there was a pause, like the world had forgotten to breathe. Then the hall erupted in applause. Denise pressed her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Eleanor clapped slowly at first, then stronger until her hands trembled. After the final performance, the judges announced the results. Malik had won. He stood frozen for a moment, not believing it until the hall rose to their feet. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed toward him, and reporters crowded around. Later, during a live interview, one of the reporters asked, "Who do you dedicate this victory to?" Malik paused. He looked down, then said softly, "To my mother, who worked harder than anyone I know, and to Mrs. Whitmore, who heard music in me before anyone else did." There was a hush, followed by applause. Eleanor smiled through her tears, proud beyond words. After the competition, things changed quickly. Newspapers ran his story across the country. "Maid's son becomes piano genius," one headline read. People wanted to know everything: where he came from, who taught him, how he learned. But Malik always gave the same answer. "My teachers showed me music, but my mother and Mrs. Whitmore showed me love. That's where it really started." He soon received invitations to perform in different cities. Denise followed him when she could, though she still worked part-time cleaning houses. She said she liked to keep busy, that it kept her grounded. Eleanor's health began to slow her down, but she never missed his performances, even if she had to watch them on television from her favorite armchair. One afternoon, a few months later, Malik returned home after a long tour. He went straight to Eleanor's house, where she sat reading by the window. Her hair was thinner now, and her hands shook slightly as she turned the pages. When she saw him, her face lit up. "There's my star," she said warmly. He smiled, sitting beside her. "I missed you. And I missed hearing that piano in my house," she said with a small laugh. "It's been too quiet without you." He reached for her hand. "You know, I wouldn't be here if you hadn't let me touch that piano all those years ago." She squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe. But the truth is, Malik, I think you would have found your way no matter what. The gift was always inside you. I just happened to open a door." He shook his head. "You opened more than that. You changed my life." Her eyes softened. "And you changed mine too." They sat together for a while in peaceful silence, the late afternoon sun filling the room. The piano stood in the corner, gleaming in the golden light. Malik got up and walked over to it. "Play something for me?" she asked quietly. He nodded, and began to play the same piece he had performed at the national competition. The music filled the house again, weaving through the rooms like a familiar spirit. Eleanor closed her eyes, smiling. When the last note faded, she whispered, "Beautiful, just beautiful." Later that evening, Denise joined them for tea. The three of them sat together, laughing about old memories. The day Malik first touched, the piano, the scolding that followed, the first recital, the nervous rides to competitions. The house that once felt cold now felt like home. That night, as Malik prepared to leave, Eleanor said softly, "Promise me something, dear." He turned to her. "Anything. Promise me you'll always play from your heart. Don't let fame or success change the way you feel about music. Remember where it came from." He nodded. "I promise." The next few years saw Malik travel across the world: Paris, London, Tokyo. He played for large audiences and met other musicians who admired his work. Yet no matter how far he went, he always sent postcards home, each one ending with the same line, "Tell Mrs. Whitmore I'm still playing." When he finally returned years later, his name had become known in the music world, but he was still the same humble boy at heart. The first place he visited wasn't a concert hall or a studio. It was the small graveyard on the hill where Eleanor had been laid to rest the year before. He stood there for a long time, holding a single white rose. "You still hear me, don't you?" he whispered. "I kept my promise." Then he went back to her house, now quiet and empty, and sat at the piano she'd once asked him to play. He touched the keys gently, and a familiar melody filled the room. It was warm and full of life, as if she were still listening. Down the street, neighbors paused to listen. Some said they'd never heard music like that before, so full of love it almost felt alive. Inside, Malik closed his eyes and smiled through the music. In that moment, it wasn't about fame or success or applause. It was about a woman who believed, a mother who sacrificed, and a boy who learned that sometimes the greatest melodies come from the simplest beginnings. And as the final notes faded into the quiet air, he whispered softly to himself, "This one's for you, Mrs. Whitmore."